A little 6-year-old beggar girl enters a luxurious real estate office, approaches the counter and holds up a small bag with penny coins. With the innocence of a child, she tells the owner, "Uncle, I want to buy a family." The man, who is actually a millionaire, is completely speechless and thinks this is just child's play. He explains to the child that this is just a real estate office that sells houses. But the girl states that she doesn't want to buy a house. When she explains the reason, the millionaire can't handle the child's answer and starts crying right there. What happens next is shocking. The rain hammered against the panoramic windows of Elite Realty Group with an almost musical insistence, creating a hypnotic rhythm that echoed through the Italian marble lobby. The aroma of premium Colombian coffee mingled with the subtle scent of polished mahogany, composing an olfactory symphony of luxury and sophistication. Edward Spencer adjusted the cuff of his Egyptian linen shirt as he reviewed the morning's contracts, his grey eyes reflecting the same calculated coldness that had made him one of the city's most successful businessmen. At 42, Edward had built a real estate empire based on 3 unyielding principles: efficiency, profit, and emotional detachment. His walls displayed photographs of spectacular mansions, each representing millions in commissions, each smiling family in perfect gardens symbolizing dreams he sold without ever allowing himself to dream. The pain of his parents' premature loss, when he was just 15, had forged an impenetrable emotional armor within him. Relationships were temporary contracts, feelings were dangerous vulnerabilities, and the heart was merely an organ that pumped blood. His assistant, Mariana, an ambitious 35-year-old woman with shrewd eyes and a calculated smile, organized documents with precise movements. She watched Edward with a mixture of professional admiration and thinly veiled personal interest, always attentive to opportunities to distinguish herself and climb the company ladder. Her heels echoed across the marble floor like a constant metric of determination. The automatic door swished open with an electronic whisper, allowing a gust of cold, damp wind to invade the climate-controlled environment. Edward looked up, expecting to see some millionaire client seeking their dream property, but found something completely out of context. A girl of approximately 6 years old, soaked from head to toe, dripping rainwater onto the immaculate marble. She was too small for her age, with brown hair plastered to her wet face and clothes that were once colorful, now faded by time and need. But it was her eyes that caught attention, deep, determined, carrying a seriousness impossible for someone so young. In her frail hands, she clutched a small, clear plastic baggie filled with loose change, which jingled softly with each hesitant step. Mariana immediately stood up, her expression mixing surprise and irritation. "Excuse me, sweetheart, but you're in the wrong place. This isn't the kind of—" she began, but was cut off as the girl walked straight past her, moving with a determination that contrasted dramatically with her fragile appearance. Edward watched, fascinated despite himself, as the child approached the main counter. She looked up, her eyes meeting his through the glass partition of his office. For a moment that seemed an eternity, time stopped. There was something in that gaze that made him uncomfortable, a purity he had forgotten existed, a hope he had buried decades ago. The girl walked directly towards him with decisive steps, her bare feet leaving wet prints on the floor. She extended her free hand and gently tugged the hem of his designer suit, forcing him to bend down to her height. The expensive scent of his aftershave contrasted with the smell of rain and innocence emanating from the child. "Mister," she whispered with devastating seriousness, "how much does a happy family cost?" "I brought money." Edward felt as if the floor had vanished beneath his feet. The girl's words echoed in his mind like an impossible-to-ignore refrain. He looked at the baggie of coins, then at the photographs of perfect families on the walls, trying to process the most sincere question he had ever heard in his adult life. "This is a real estate agency, sweetheart. We sell houses," he managed to say, his voice softer than he intended. Her response hit him like a punch to the gut. "But you sell families on the wall. I wanted to take one home for me and Grandma because nobody wants to play with someone who doesn't have a mum or dad." Edward Spencer, the man who had closed multi-million-dollar contracts without flinching, who had resisted blackmail and pressure from the most powerful, felt his emotional armor crack for the first time in decades. And at that moment, he knew his life would never be the same. The silence that followed the girl's words was as thick as fog, filling every corner of the elegant lobby. Edward remained crouched before her, his grey eyes trying to decipher the child's logic behind that devastating question. Mariana watched the scene with growing discomfort, her fingers drumming nervously on the desk, clearly anxious to end this embarrassing situation that didn't fit the company's impeccable routine. "Sweetheart," Edward said finally, his voice carrying a gentleness he didn't know he still possessed. "What's your name?" "Sophia," she replied promptly, shaking the baggie of coins with evident pride. "And you own the families, right? Grandma said that anyone with money can buy anything." Edward felt a tightness in his chest he couldn't explain. There was something in Sophia's devastating simplicity that completely disarmed his business logic. She wasn't begging or trying to elicit pity. She was trying to make a legitimate commercial transaction with all the seriousness a 6-year-old could muster. "Sophia, those photographs show houses where families live," he explained patiently, pointing to the promotional banners. "People already have their families. We just sell the houses they live in." Sophia's eyes filled with a deep sadness that contrasted violently with her previous determination. She looked at the photographs again, then at her coins, as if recalculating some complex plan she had created in her child's mind. "But I thought," her voice faltered for a moment, "I thought if I saved enough money, I could buy a mom and a dad like the ones on the wall. Grandma is very sick, and I don't want to be alone when she goes to heaven." Edward felt as if someone had tightened a rope around his throat. The brutal honesty of the child was demolishing, brick by brick, the barriers he had built to protect himself from exactly this kind of pain. Mariana approached, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation's direction. "Mr. Spencer, perhaps it's best to—" she began, but Edward interrupted her with a discreet wave of his hand. He slowly stood up, feeling the weight of every word Sophia had said. His rational mind told him to call social services, to resolve the situation practically and efficiently. But something deeper, something he had buried long ago, screamed that this child was before him for a reason that transcended coincidence. "Sophia, are you hungry?" he asked, surprising himself with his own question. "I can buy you a snack." Her answer was categorical and unexpected. "No thanks, mister. I just want a family." Edward was momentarily speechless. In his life experience, money had always been the universal solution to all problems. Difficult contracts, dissatisfied employees, bureaucratic obstacles. Everything was resolved with the right amount offered at the right time. But here was a 6-year-old child refusing his financial help because it didn't relate to her true desire. "Are you sure? It won't cost anything," he insisted, still trying to apply his usual logic. "I'm sure," Sophia said with a firmness that impressed Edward. "Money, you spend it, and it's gone. Family is forever, even when you can't see them." She paused, looking at the photographs again. "Grandma said my parents are waiting for me in heaven, but I wanted to have a family here too, so she wouldn't worry when she goes to meet them there." The simplicity of Sophia's logic was devastating in its purity. Edward realized he was facing something his money, his influence, and his business success could not buy or resolve. The child didn't want charity. She wanted belonging, love, emotional security, things he himself had learned to live without, building an entire life based on the premise that they were unnecessary and dangerous luxuries. Mariana cleared her throat discreetly, reminding him of the meeting he had in 15 minutes with important investors. But Edward barely heard her. His attention was completely focused on the girl who had just refused his first offer of help, forcing him to confront an uncomfortable reality. Some problems could not be solved by simply opening his wallet. "Sophia," he said finally, "where exactly do you and your grandma live?" "In Maplewood Gardens, right by the creek. The house is tiny, but Grandma planted flowers in tin cans she turned into pots. They're really pretty when it's not raining too hard." Sophia spoke with evident pride, as if she were describing a palace. Edward knew Maplewood Gardens, a modest, low-income neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, known for its sanitation issues and the constant threat of eviction from landlords. The fact that Sophia referred to that place as home with such affection revealed a worldview that deeply moved him. "And your grandma, is she very sick?" he asked, trying to maintain a casual tone. "She coughs a lot and sometimes can't get out of bed. She says it's just tiredness. But I know she worries because she can't clean rich people's houses anymore." Sophia lowered her voice as if sharing a secret. "That's why I decided I'm going to find a family for us. Then she won't have to worry about anything anymore." Edward felt as if someone had squeezed his heart in a vice. Sophia's determination to solve her grandmother's problems through such an innocently impossible solution revealed a pure love and emotional maturity that left him profoundly uncomfortable. That child was willing to give everything she had, her few coins, her energy, her hope, to protect the only person left in her world, and him. What had he done with his life besides accumulate wealth and build emotional walls to avoid feeling exactly the kind of unconditional love Sophia demonstrated so naturally? "Sophia," he said finally, "how about we talk a little more about this? I have some ideas that might help." Her eyes lit up like stars. "You'll teach me how to get a real family." Edward didn't know the answer, but for the first time in decades, he was willing to find out. That night, Edward couldn't sleep. Lying in his king-size bed in his penthouse apartment, he stared at the ceiling as Sophia's words echoed in his mind like a disturbing mantra. How much does a happy family cost? The question had planted a seed of restlessness that grew by the hour, making him question everything he had built in his adult life. The next morning, he arrived at the realty office earlier than usual, but he couldn't focus on the contracts awaiting his signature. Mariana noticed his distraction, watching him with a calculating gaze as he absently scribbled on a piece of paper, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. "Mr. Spencer, are you all right?" she asked, placing a steaming coffee on his desk. Yesterday was an unusual day. Edward looked up, meeting Mariana's professional smile that barely disguised her curiosity. "I'm fine, Mariana. Just thinking about a few things." He paused, making a decision that surprised himself. "I need you to cancel my morning appointments. I have a personal matter to attend to." Mariana's expression subtly shifted. In 5 years of working with Edward, she had never seen him alter his schedule for personal reasons. The man was a machine of efficiency, treating time as the most precious resource in the world. "Of course, it's sir. Can I help with anything?" "No, thank you. It's something I need to do alone." Edward left the office and drove to Maplewood Gardens, a journey that took almost an hour through neighborhoods that became progressively simpler and more modest. He had never set foot in that part of the city, despite knowing its name from police reports and television news. When he finally arrived, he parked his BMW on a potholed asphalt street and observed the surroundings. The houses were small, basic constructions, many with asphalt shingle roofs and small, makeshift gardens. Children played in the street despite it being school hours, while women chatted in small groups on the uneven sidewalks. The contrast with his world of glass and marble was stark, but there was something about the community that intrigued him, a sense of neighborhood and closeness he hadn't experienced in years. Discreetly asking local residents, Edward managed to locate the house where Sophia lived with her grandmother. It was a tiny structure with faded blue painted walls and a small porch where recycled tin cans served as colorful flower pots, exactly as Sophia had described with such pride. From a safe distance, he observed the house's routine. Around 10 in the morning, an elderly woman of approximately 60 years old stumbled out, leaning on the wall. Even from a distance, Edward could see that she was visibly frail, her movements slow and careful, suggesting extreme fatigue or illness. She carried a plastic bucket and a broom, clearly preparing to go out to work despite her condition. Sophia appeared at the door, running after her grandmother with a worried expression. Edward couldn't hear the conversation, but he saw the girl gesturing, clearly trying to convince the elder woman to go back inside. The grandmother shook her head negatively, kissed Sophia's forehead, and walked away with difficulty, leaving the child at the door with an expression of deep sadness. Edward felt his chest tighten as he witnessed that scene. The grandmother's determination to work despite her illness, combined with Sophia's evident concern, painted a picture of dignity and love that deeply moved him. He realized he was observing a version of family very different from the promotional photographs in his real estate office, a family broken by circumstances but united by genuine emotional bonds. Deciding to investigate further, Edward discreetly followed the grandmother to a nearby commercial area where she began offering her cleaning services to local shops. He observed, disguised, as she was rejected by several establishments, her physical condition clearly discouraging potential employers. Finally, a small bakery accepted her services, but Edward noticed that she frequently had to stop to cough, leaning on walls to catch her breath. During lunch, he returned to Maplewood Gardens and found Sophia playing alone in the small yard, building little houses with stones and twigs. She hummed a children's song as she organized her play, creating small families with the available objects. Edward watched, fascinated, as she narrated stories to herself about moms, dads, and children living happily in their improvised homes. "This family is going to the beach," she'd say to herself, moving a smooth stone. "And this one is going on a picnic in the park. When Grandma comes back, I'll tell her all the adventures they had." Sophia's innocence in creating imaginary worlds where complete families lived happy adventures contrasted painfully with her reality. Edward realized that the girl wasn't just dreaming of a family, she was actively creating narratives of belonging and joy as a way to cope with her loneliness. When her grandmother returned in the late afternoon, clearly exhausted, Edward observed how Sophia ran to help her, taking the broom and bucket from her trembling hands. The girl guided the elderly woman to a chair on the porch, brought her a glass of water, and began excitedly telling her about her day's playtime. Trying to elicit smiles from her tired face, Edward remained in his car, watching that demonstration of mutual care that transcended any traditional definition of family. Here was the unconditional love Sophia sought to buy, already existing, already present, but threatened by illness, poverty, and the uncertainty of the future. When he finally drove back home, Edward carried with him a deeply uncomfortable understanding. Sophia didn't need to buy a family. She already had one, imperfect and vulnerable, but built on foundations of genuine love that he himself had spent his entire life avoiding. The question now was, what would he do with this discovery? Edward spent the next 2 days discreetly researching the situation in Maplewood Gardens. His contacts in the real estate world confirmed what he suspected. The area was under constant threat of eviction due to land disputes between the city and private landowners. Many families lived with overdue rent, including, he discovered through public records, Helena Santos, 62 years old, Sophia's grandmother. Helena's file revealed a history of hard work and quiet dignity. Widowed 10 years ago, she had raised Sophia since the girl was a baby. After her parents died in a car accident, she had worked as a domestic helper for over 40 years, always fulfilling her commitments until respiratory problems began to affect her ability to work regularly. The rent was 3 months overdue, totaling a debt of $800, a paltry sum for Edward, but seemingly impossible for Helena. Eviction was scheduled for the following week, which explains Sophia's desperate urgency to find a solution for her family situation. Edward made a decision he believed to be simple and efficient. He would resolve the financial problem anonymously, allowing Helena and Sophia to remain in their home without knowing where the help came from. It was the kind of solution he applied in business: direct, practical, without emotional complications. On Thursday morning, he instructed his accountant to make a bank transfer to Helena's account, covering not only the overdue rent, but also 6 months in advance. To justify the payment, he created a story about a city housing assistance program that had randomly selected some families to receive aid. Edward felt genuine satisfaction imagining Helena's relief upon discovering that her financial worries had been resolved. For the first time in years, he experienced the sensation of using his money for something other than personal profit. It was a strange feeling, but not unpleasant. On Friday, he drove again to Maplewood Gardens, expecting to find Sophia and Helena celebrating their good fortune. He parked in a position where he could observe the blue house, anticipating the moment he would realize he had done something genuinely good for that family that had touched him so deeply. What he saw, however, was completely unexpected. Helena was on the porch, holding papers Edward recognized as bank statements, but her expression was not one of relief or gratitude. It was one of confusion and deep concern. Sophia was by her side, watching her grandmother with big, questioning eyes. Edward watched as Helena picked up an old phone and dialed a number. Even from a distance, he could see that she was agitated, gesturing as she spoke. After a few minutes, she hung up and went inside with Sophia, returning moments later with an envelope. Intrigued and increasingly worried, Edward discreetly followed her when she left the house, walking towards the city center. Helena went directly to the local bank, where she remained for almost an hour. When she came out, her expression was even more tense. Unable to contain his curiosity, Edward entered the bank after Helena left and, using his influence as a premium client of the institution, managed to speak with the manager about the situation. What he discovered left him completely bewildered. Helena had returned the money. Miss Santos insisted there was some error, explained the manager, a middle-aged man clearly confused by the situation. She said she never applied for any city program and couldn't accept money that wasn't hers. She was very firm in her decision. Even when I explained that everything was correct in the documentation, Edward felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. His elegant and efficient solution had been completely rejected by the dignity of a woman who preferred to face her financial problems rather than accept help she didn't fully understand. Helena had chosen the uncertainty of imminent eviction over accepting what she considered unsolicited charity, returning to Maplewood Gardens. Edward found Helena back on the porch, explaining the situation to Sophia with carefully chosen words. He couldn't hear the conversation, but he saw the girl nodding, as if she perfectly understood her grandmother's decision. "Sometimes things that are too good to be true really are," Helena was saying, stroking Sophia's hair. "We need to earn things through our own hard work, my granddaughter. That's how we keep our dignity." Sophia hugged her grandmother tightly. "I understand, Grandma. That's why I'll keep looking for a family for us. There has to be a right way to get one." Edward remained in the car, observing that demonstration of integrity that left him simultaneously admired and completely frustrated. He had tried to solve the problem in the simplest way possible, but he had discovered that Helena and Sophia operated under a moral code that made it impossible to accept help they couldn't comprehend or reciprocate. For the first time in his adult life, Edward faced a problem that couldn't be solved by simply applying money. Helena and Sophia were not products to be bought or situations to be manipulated through financial influence. They were people with dignity, principles, and a value system he hadn't considered in his initial approach. As he drove back home, Edward realized he had completely underestimated the complexity of the situation. If he truly wanted to help that family, he would have to find a way that respected their dignity and allowed them to maintain their integrity. But how to do that without revealing his own growing emotional vulnerability? How to help without exposing himself to the kind of personal involvement he had spent decades avoiding? The answer, Edward was beginning to realize, would be much more complicated than any business he had ever conducted. The weekend passed like an eternity for Edward. He walked through the empty rooms of his luxurious apartment, feeling for the first time the echo of his own solitude. The glass walls that once symbolized success and modernity now seemed like transparent barriers, separating him from a world of genuine connections he had chosen to avoid. On Monday, his business concentration was completely compromised. Mariana noticed his constant distractions, the way he looked out the window towards the street, as if waiting to see something or someone specific. During an important meeting with international investors, Edward lost his train of thought 3 times, forcing Mariana to intervene diplomatically to keep the meeting on track. "Mr. Spencer," she said after the clients left, "may I speak frankly with you?" Edward stared at her, noticing for the first time the calculating ambition that had always shone in his assistant's eyes. "Of course, Mariana. What is it? You haven't been the same since that incident with the girl. I know it's not my business, but I'm concerned about the company's image. Our clients expect to find the Edward Spencer known for his professional detachment and rational decisions." Mariana's words hit Edward like sharp knives. She was right. He wasn't the same man. The emotional armor he had carefully built was developing cracks that allowed long-buried feelings to begin seeping into his professional life. "Are you suggesting I ignore a vulnerable child to maintain my professional image?" he asked, his voice carrying a coldness he didn't feel. "I'm suggesting there are appropriate institutions to handle these situations," Mariana replied carefully. "You have responsibilities to the company, to employees, to investors. A perfect family cannot be built on emotional impulses." Edward remained silent for a long moment, processing Mariana's words. She was articulating exactly the thoughts he himself had cultivated for decades. The belief that emotional involvement was incompatible with professional success, that vulnerability was a weakness that should be eliminated. But then the image of Sophia appeared in his mind, a 6-year-old child willing to give her last pennies to buy something that wasn't for sale, demonstrating a courage he himself had never possessed. How could he return to his old life knowing someone like her existed in the world? "Mariana," he said finally, "I need you to do something for me. I want you to arrange a meeting with the city's social services, not to give up Sophia, to see how I can legally help." Mariana's expression subtly changed, a mix of surprise and something that looked almost disappointment. "Mr. Spencer, are you sure this is the best approach? Direct involvement with social services can generate unwanted publicity. What if the press finds out?" Edward paused, considering for the first time the public implications of his actions. As a successful businessman, he had always been careful to keep his personal life out of the spotlight. Any association with social issues could be misinterpreted, especially at a time when scandals involving public figures and children were frequent headlines. "Do you think this could be a problem?" he asked, genuinely concerned. "It could be interpreted in several ways," Mariana said with calculated care. "A single, wealthy man without family, suddenly interested in a needy girl. Some journalists might create narratives that don't match your true intentions." Edward felt nauseous. The innocence of his relationship with Sophia and Helena was being deliberately twisted into something dirty and suspicious. People who had never experienced genuine love seemed incapable of recognizing it when they saw it. "Mariana, arrange the meeting anyway," he decided, but with complete discretion. No official records yet. I just want to understand what legal options are available. That afternoon, Edward met with a social worker in a discreet coffee shop away from the city's business district. Clara Jenkins, a 40-year-old woman with kind but experienced eyes, listened to his story with professional attention. "Mr. Spencer," she said when he finished, "your intention is admirable, but I must be honest. Cases like this are extremely complex. Helena Santos is Sophia's legal guardian, and as long as there's no evidence of neglect or incapacitation, social services cannot intervene simply based on financial difficulties. What if I wanted to help officially? Adoption, guardianship, some kind of legal support?" Clara studied him carefully. Adoption would require Helena to legally relinquish her rights to Sophia. Knowing the profile of grandmothers like her, that's highly unlikely. Shared guardianship would be possible, but it would require extensive social investigation, including an analysis of your motivations, emotional stability, financial capacity. Is that a problem? For financial capacity? Certainly not. Clara smiled slightly. But social investigations can be invasive. Your personal life would be analyzed in detail. Past relationships, mental health, motivations for the sudden interest in family matters. She paused significantly. And such processes generate public records. Eventually, information can leak. Edward felt as if he were navigating an emotional minefield. Every attempt to help Sophia and Helena seemed to create new obstacles and risks. But giving up would mean returning to his old life, pretending he had never met a child willing to spend her last pennies to buy something he himself had never managed to find: a happy family. "Clara," he said finally, "what would you do in my place?" The social worker looked at him with an expression that blended professionalism and human compassion. "I would start slowly. Build a relationship of trust with the family. Offer help in ways that preserved their dignity, and prepare yourself for the possibility that doing the right thing sometimes means accepting personal risks." Edward left the meeting with more questions than answers, but with a growing certainty. His life had irrevocably changed the moment Sophia tugged at the hem of his suit and asked how much a happy family cost. The following Tuesday, Edward made a decision that would change everything. Unable to endure inaction any longer, he decided to approach Helena directly, with complete honesty about his intentions. It was risky, vulnerable, completely contrary to all his self-preservation instincts, but he felt he had no other choice. He arrived in Maplewood Gardens in the mid-afternoon, knowing Sophia would be playing in the yard and Helena resting from her morning's work. He took a deep breath, nervously adjusted a tie he wasn't wearing in a nervous gesture, and walked to the door of the blue house. Helena answered the door with an expression of surprise and caution. Edward realized she recognized him. Sophia had probably mentioned the realtor Mr. who had talked to her. "Ms. Santos," Edward began, respectfully removing a hat he wasn't wearing in a nervous gesture. "My name is Edward Spencer. I believe Sophia mentioned our encounter at my real estate office." "Yes," Helena replied cautiously. "She told me about the kind man who explained that families aren't bought." Her voice carried a weary dignity that deeply touched Edward. "I'd like to talk to you about Sophia, if you'll allow me a few minutes." Helena studied him for a long moment, her experienced eyes trying to decipher his intentions. Finally, she nodded and invited him to sit on the small porch, where two plastic chairs offered a view of the yard where Sophia played, oblivious to the adults' conversation. "Ms. Santos," Edward began, choosing his words carefully, "Sophia deeply touched me with her question about buying a family. Since then, I can't stop thinking about your situation." Helena stiffened slightly. "If you came here to offer charity, I can save you time. We don't accept handouts." "I didn't come to offer charity," Edward said quickly. "I came to propose something different. A partnership, if I may call it that." Helena's expression changed to genuine confusion. What kind of partnership? Edward had rehearsed this moment dozens of times, but now, before Helena's quiet dignity, his prepared words seemed inadequate. He decided to speak directly from the heart. Mrs. Santos, I lost my parents when I was a teenager. Since then, I've built a life based on avoiding deep emotional connections. I have money, success, everything society considers important, but I don't have a family. Sophia made me realize that perhaps I've built the wrong kind of life. Helena listened in silence, her eyes never leaving his face. What I'm proposing, Edward continued, is that I help you both in a way that preserves your dignity and, selfishly, allows me to learn what it means to have a real family. How so? Helena asked, her voice softer now. Let me be an uncle to Sophia. Not officially, not legally yet, but emotionally. Let me help with her expenses, school, clothes, food, as a relative would. In return, let me be part of your lives. Let me learn how to love unconditionally. Helena remained silent for a long time, watching Sophia, who had stopped playing and was slowly approaching, sensing the seriousness of the conversation. Uncle Edward, Sophia exclaimed with genuine joy upon seeing him, you came to visit us. I did, Edward replied, surprised by how easily Sophia had called him uncle. I was talking to your grandma about how we can be a family, even if in a different way. Sophia looked between Edward and Helena, her eyes shining with understanding. Like in the pictures on your wall? But for real this time? Edward felt a lump in his throat. Yes, Sophia, like in the pictures, but for real. Helena watched the interaction between Edward and Sophia, seeing something in his eyes that made her reconsider her defenses. There was a genuine vulnerability there, a need that mirrored her granddaughter's, just manifested differently. Mr. Edward, she said finally, may I be direct with you? Please. Sophia and I are already a family. Small, imperfect to be, but complete in the love we feel for each other. If you want to be part of that, you are welcome. But if you're looking for a charity project or a way to feel better about yourself, I'd prefer you leave now. Helena's brutal honesty completely disarmed Edward. She had touched the raw nerve of his own uncertainties about his motivations. Was he doing this for Sophia and Helena, or for himself? Mrs. Santos, he said after a long pause. I don't know if I can separate those motivations completely. I know I want to help you, but I also know I need you. Sophia asked me a question that changed my life, and now I need to learn the answer alongside her. Helena studied his face for another moment, then looked at Sophia, who watched the two adults with a touching seriousness. Grandma, Sophia said softly, I like Uncle Edward. His eyes are sad sometimes, like mine used to be. Maybe we can help him too. It was Sophia's innocent observation that broke Helena's last resistances. The child had perceived something the adults were trying to rationalize. Sometimes helping someone means allowing that person to help us too. All right, Helena said finally, extending her hand to Edward. But with conditions. This isn't charity, it's family. And family means commitment. It means being present in the difficult times, not just the convenient ones. Edward shook her hand, feeling the weight of the commitment he was making. I understand, Ms. Santos, and I accept. Sophia shrieked with joy and ran to embrace them both, creating an impossible circle of intertwined arms on the small porch of the blue house. Edward closed his eyes, feeling for the first time in decades what it meant to belong to something greater than himself. He didn't know yet that Mariana had discreetly photographed his arrival in Maplewood Gardens, nor that these photos were already being sent to specific contacts in the local press. The moment of pure happiness he was experiencing would be tested very soon by forces he didn't even imagine were in motion. For now, however, Edward Spencer had found his answer to Sophia's question. A happy family had no price because it wasn't for sale. It could only be built through courage. vulnerability, and the willingness to risk one's heart. On Thursday morning, Edward woke with a sense of lightness he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in decades, he had plans beyond contracts and profits. He would spend the afternoon with Sophia, helping her with homework, while Helena rested. The prospect of being part of a family routine filled him with an eager anticipation he didn't know he possessed. He arrived at the realty office, whistling a tune, a change so radical in his behavior that the employees exchanged surprised glances. Mariana watched him from the reception desk, her calculating eyes registering every detail of her boss's transformation. When he passed her desk, she smiled with an artificial sweetness that didn't reach her eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Spencer. You seem different today." "Good morning, Mariana. I'm well, thank you." Edward paused, noticing something strange in her tone. "Is there a problem I should know about?" "Not exactly a problem," she replied, hesitating theatrically. "But I received some calls this morning. Journalists asking questions about your recent activities." Edward felt a chill run down his spine. "What kind of questions?" Mariana opened a drawer and pulled out several printed photographs, spreading them across the desk with calculatedly slow movements. Edward immediately recognized the images. Him walking to Helena's house, talking on the porch, hugging Sophia. "Where did you get these photos?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "They're circulating among some press outlets," Mariana replied, avoiding answering the question directly. "Apparently, someone found your visits to the neighborhood interesting to document." Edward picked up the photographs, studying them with growing horror. Out of context, the images could be interpreted in completely distorted ways. He saw himself through the eyes of ill-intentioned people. A wealthy, single man, secretly visiting a needy child in her home. "What kind of questions are the journalists asking?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Questions about your motivations for suddenly becoming interested in social issues," Mariana said with false concern. "About why a successful businessman would be discreetly visiting a 6-year-old girl. About whether there are aspects of the story the public should know." Edward felt nauseous. The innocence of his relationship with Sophia and Helena was being deliberately twisted into something dirty and suspicious. People who had never experienced genuine love seemed incapable of recognizing it when they saw it. "Mariana, I want you to immediately contact our legal department. These insinuations are defamatory and—" "Mr. Spencer," she interrupted him softly, "perhaps we should consider a different approach. Legal battles against the press tend to generate even more negative publicity. Sometimes it's best to simply step away from the situation causing problems." Edward stared at her, noticing for the first time the calculated coldness behind Mariana's apparent concern. "Are you suggesting I abandon Sophia and Helena to protect my reputation?" "I'm suggesting you consider the long-term consequences," she replied carefully. "For your company, your employees, your investors, and frankly, for the child herself. What kind of life will she have if she remains at the center of a media scandal?" Mariana's words struck Edward like sharp daggers. She had touched on his greatest fear, that his attempt to help Sophia might end up harming her even more. The idea that his presence in the girl's life could expose her to cruel judgments and malicious speculation made him physically ill. At that moment, his phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Edward Spencer," he answered cautiously. "Mr. Spencer, this is Robert Evans from the City Herald. I'd like to ask a few questions about your relationship with a minor in Maplewood Gardens." Edward hung up immediately, but the phone rang again seconds later. It was another journalist, then another. Within minutes, his direct line was being bombarded by reporters looking for a sensational story. Mariana watched everything with an expression that mixed thinly veiled satisfaction with theatrical concern. "Mr. Spencer, I must remind you that we have the meeting with the Japanese investors this afternoon. They are extremely conservative on matters of corporate reputation." Edward looked at the photographs spread across the desk. then at Mariana, then at the phone that wouldn't stop ringing. His business mind automatically began calculating the potential damage: cancelled contracts, worried investors, employees questioning the company's stability. But then he thought of Sophia, probably waiting for him at that moment, perhaps even telling the other children about her Uncle Edward, who had promised to help her with homework. He thought of Helena, who had lowered her defenses to accept his help, trusting him despite all her self-preservation instincts. "Mariana," he said finally, his voice firmer than he felt, "cancel all my appointments this afternoon, and I want a full investigation into how these photographs reached the press." "Mr. Spencer, are you sure that—" "I'm sure," Edward interrupted her. "And Mariana, the next time someone questions my motivations for helping a child, tell them it's because it's the right thing to do. If that's not explanation enough, the problem isn't mine." Edward grabbed the photographs and left the real estate office, leaving Mariana alone with an expression that mixed shock and something that looked almost disappointment. She had underestimated the depth of Edward's transformation. The man who walked out of his office was no longer the cold, calculating businessman she knew. He was someone willing to risk everything for love, exactly the kind of vulnerability she had planned to exploit. As Edward drove to Maplewood Gardens, determined to protect Sophia and Helena from the scandal that was brewing, he didn't know that the storm was just beginning. Mariana was already making calls, planting seeds of doubt in the minds of important investors, preparing the ground for the next move of her carefully orchestrated strategy. The war for Edward Spencer's soul had officially begun. Edward arrived in Maplewood Gardens in a race against time, praying that the rumors hadn't reached Helena and Sophia yet. He parked his car a few streets before the Blue House and walked quickly, trying to seem casual while checking if there were journalists or photographers in the area. As he turned the corner, his heart sank. There were 3 men with cameras and recording equipment strategically positioned around Helena's house. One of them was clearly trying to convince a neighbor to talk, while the other 2 photographed everything that moved on the small property. Edward pulled out his cell phone and called Helena, hoping she would answer quickly. "Hello?" Helena's voice sounded tense, as if she already knew something was wrong. "Miss Santos, it's Edward. Please, don't leave the house and don't let Sophia go near the windows. There are some reporters on the street who might try to bother you." "Reporters?" Helena repeated, her voice filled with confusion and growing panic. "For heaven's sake, what's going on?" Edward felt his chest tighten. How to explain to a dignified and private woman that her kindness had been distorted into material for sensational gossip? "It's a temporary situation, Miss Santos. Some ill-intentioned people are trying to create a story where none exists. I'll take care of it. But I need you both to stay safe inside the house for now." "Edward," Helena's voice trembled slightly, "what exactly are these people saying about us?" Edward closed his eyes, hating to utter the words. "And they're implying that my intentions with Sophia are not appropriate. It's a lie, of course, but you know how these things work." The silence on the other end of the line was devastating. Edward could imagine Helena processing the information, realizing that her decision to accept his help had exposed her family to a type of scrutiny she had never imagined. "Oh my God," she whispered finally. "Sophia can't go through this. She's just a child." "I know. And I'll protect you both, I promise. But I need you to trust me a little more." Edward hung up and assessed the situation, his business mind calculating options. He couldn't simply confront the journalists. That would generate even more sensational material, nor could he ignore them, leaving Helena and Sophia prisoners in their own home. He decided to act strategically. He circled the block and entered Helena's house through the back door, which opened onto a small alley. Helena greeted him with an expression that mingled relief and deep concern. "Where's Sophia?" was her first question. "In her room, doing homework. I told her it was best to stay there for now." Helena studied him with tired eyes. "Edward, tell me the truth. What kind of trouble have you brought into our lives? The question stung more than any accusation the journalist could make. Edward found himself confronted with the possibility that his attempt to help had, in fact, made Helena and Sophia's lives much more complicated. Miss Santos, I swear I never imagined this could happen. There are people who can't believe someone wants to help a child without ulterior motives. And there aren't any, Helena asked, her voice low but direct. Ulterior motives, I mean... Edward met her gaze, realizing this was the moment for complete truth. Yes, there are. I need you, as much as you need me. Sophia made me realize that I built an empty life, based only on money and success. I want to learn to truly love. I want to have a family. Is that selfish? Helena observed him for a long moment, then shook her head. No, Edward, that's human. The problem is, not everyone will understand. At that moment, Sophia appeared in the bedroom doorway, carrying a notebook and a pencil. Uncle Edward, you came to help me with math. Edward looked at the radiant child, completely oblivious to the chaos forming around her life, and felt a fierce determination swell in his chest. No one had the right to turn Sophia's innocence into fodder for scandal. I did, sweetheart, he said, forcing a smile. But today we'll do our homework inside, okay? Why? Sophia asked, approaching the window. Who are those men outside with the big cameras? Helena and Edward exchanged desperate glances. How to explain to a 6-year-old that her search for a family had become entertainment for people who had never felt true love? They're people who like to take pictures, Edward said carefully. But today, it would be better if we played away from them. Sophia nodded, apparently satisfied with the explanation, and sat at the small kitchen table with her notebooks. Edward helped her with the math problems, but his mind raced, trying to find a way to protect that family from the media circus he had inadvertently created. His phone constantly vibrated with calls from unknown numbers. More journalists, probably. He also received messages from worried clients, from Mariana offering help, and even from competitors who clearly saw an opportunity to exploit his vulnerable situation. Uncle Edward, Sophia suddenly said, looking up from her lesson, are you sad? Your eyes look like they did before. When we first met, Edward realized his distress was showing, despite his efforts to seem normal. I'm not sad, Sophia. I'm just thinking about how to protect you and your grandma. Protect from what? She asked with a child's natural curiosity. Edward looked at Helena, who nodded slightly, giving him permission to be honest within appropriate limits. Sometimes, when people do good things, other people who don't quite understand get confused and say things that aren't true, he explained. That's what's happening now. Sophia frowned, processing the information. But you're just trying to be our family. There's nothing wrong with that. The devastating simplicity of Sophia's observation hit Edward like lightning. A 6-year-old child understood perfectly what was happening. While supposedly intelligent adults concocted conspiracy theories and sensational narratives, "You're right, sweetheart," he said, kissing the top of her head. "There's nothing wrong, and I'm going to make sure everyone else understands that too." But even as he made that promise, Edward had no idea how he could keep it. The journalists out there weren't interested in the truth. They were interested in a story that would sell newspapers. And he was beginning to realize that he might have severely underestimated the destructive power of people determined to turn love into scandal. Edward spent the night in his penthouse, but sleep was impossible. With each passing hour, he checked the news online and watched his situation progressively worsen. Tabloid sites had twisted his story with Sophia into a sordid narrative, using headlines like "Millionaire Businessman and the Mysterious Girl," and "What does a rich man want with a poor child?" Reader comments were even worse. Cruel speculations about his motivations, conspiracy theories about pedophilia and child exploitation, discussions about how rich men always get away with it. Edward felt nauseous reading people debating Sophia's life as if she were a soap opera character, not a real child with real feelings. At 5 in the morning, his phone rang. It was Helena, and her voice was filled with panic. "Edward, I need to talk to you urgently. Can you come here?" "Of course, Ms. Santos. Is everything all right? How's Sophia?" She saw the news on the neighbor's TV last night. She didn't understand everything, but..." Helena's voice broke. "She asked if you were going to stop being our uncle because of the bad people who don't like it when families are happy." Edward felt as if someone had torn his heart from his chest. Sophia's innocence had been tainted by people who turned love into entertainment. "I'll be right there." When he arrived in Maplewood Gardens, he noticed that the journalists had multiplied overnight. There were at least 6 different vehicles on the street, with reporters and photographers setting up a kind of informal camp. Edward had to park 3 blocks away and walk through the alleys to reach Helena's house undetected. Helena received him at the back door with a devastated expression. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and Edward realized she had aged years in a single night. "Helena, I'm so sorry. All of this is my fault." "It's not about blame now, Edward," she said, her voice tired but determined. "Oh, Dee, it's about what we're going to do." Sophia woke up in the middle of the night asking if the bad people were going to take you away from her. I had to lie and say everything would be fine. Edward entered the house and found Sophia sitting on the living room floor, silently playing with her makeshift dolls. When she saw him, she ran into his arms with a force that almost knocked him over. "Uncle Edward, I knew you wouldn't leave. Grandma said real families stick together even when there's a storm." Edward hugged Sophia tightly, feeling tears he hadn't shed in decades burn his eyes. How could a 6-year-old have more wisdom about love and loyalty than all the adults who were trying to destroy their family? "I'll never leave, sweetheart," he whispered. "I promise." Helena approached, her expression serious. "Edward, I need to tell you something. Early this morning, a social worker showed up here. She said they received an anonymous complaint about inadequate guardianship conditions and that they're going to conduct an investigation." Edward felt his blood run cold. An anonymous complaint. She was very polite, but it was clear that someone is trying to use this situation to question my ability to care for Sophia. Helena paused, looking at her granddaughter who was playing a few feet away. "Edward, I'm scared they'll try to take her from me." The possibility hit Edward like a punch to the gut. He realized the attacks weren't just against him. They were against the entire family they had tried to build. Someone was deliberately trying to destroy the only good thing he had found in decades. "Ms. Santos," he said, his voice low but determined, "I know this will sound crazy, but I need you both to leave here for a few days. Let me resolve this situation away from you." Helena stared at him in surprise. "Leave for where?" "I have a small apartment downtown that I use occasionally for discreet meetings. No one would know you're there. I can provide everything you need while I fight these accusations." "Edward," Helena said carefully, "if we go with you now, won't that make the situation even worse? Won't people say you're kidnapping a child?" Edward had thought about it. But the alternative, leaving Sophia exposed to the media circus and the impending social investigations, seemed much worse. "It might get worse temporarily," he admitted, "but at least you'll be safe while I find a way to prove that all of this is a farce." Helena remained silent for a long moment, looking at Sophia, then at Edward, clearly weighing impossible options. Finally, she sighed deeply. "All right, but on one condition. If at any point you think our presence is hurting more than helping, you let us come back home, regardless of the consequences." Edward agreed, knowing that Helena was making a decision that went against all her self-preservation instincts. She was trusting him not only with her own life, but with Sophia's, the most precious person in her world. They spent the morning discreetly packing some essential clothes and belongings. Sophia was excited about the adventure of staying in a new house without fully understanding the gravity of the situation. For her, it was just another proof that true families face challenges together. At 2 in the afternoon, when most journalists had left for lunch, Edward managed to get Helena and Sophia out the back door and to his car, parked several streets away. The drive to the apartment was tense, with Edward constantly checking if they were being followed. When they finally arrived at the small downtown apartment, a space Edward only used for confidential meetings, Helena looked around with an expression that mixed gratitude and concern. "Edward, are you sure this is a good idea?" Edward watched Sophia explore the new environment with childlike curiosity, without a shadow of fear or anxiety. The girl's absolute trust in him was both inspiring and terrifying. "Ms. Santos," he said, "I'm not sure of anything else, but I know I can't let them destroy our family before it even has a chance to flourish." That night, while Sophia slept peacefully in the guest room and Helena rested on the couch, Edward stayed awake on the balcony, looking out at the city and realizing he had crossed a line from which he could no longer return. He had chosen Sophia and Helena above his reputation, his company, his safety, and, for the first time in his life, he felt completely at peace with the decision that could destroy everything he had built. The next morning, Edward woke to the insistent sound of his phone ringing. It was Mariana, her voice laden with an urgency that barely disguised satisfaction. "Mr. Spencer, you need to come to the office immediately. We have a critical situation." Edward looked at Sophia, who was sleeping peacefully in the bed next to him, and at Helena, who was carefully making coffee in the small kitchen, trying not to make noise. "What kind of situation, Mariana?" "I'd rather not discuss it over the phone, but it involves our main investors and the police." Edward felt his stomach drop. "The police? They want to ask some questions about the whereabouts of a missing minor." Edward hung up the phone with trembling hands. Helena, who had overheard part of the conversation, approached with an expression of growing terror. "Edward, what's happening?" "Someone must have reported Sophia as missing," he explained, his mind racing to understand the implications. "Technically, you both left home without notifying the authorities during an active social investigation." Helena brought her hand to her mouth, realizing the gravity of what they had done. "Oh my God, does this mean you're being accused of kidnapping?" Edward didn't answer, but his expression confirmed Helena's worst fears. They had tried to protect Sophia, but had inadvertently provided perfect ammunition for anyone who wanted to destroy their family. Sophia woke at that moment, stretching with the innocence of a child who had no idea that her simple presence had become the center of a legal and media storm. "Good morning, Uncle Edward. Good morning, Grandma," she said cheerfully, running to hug them both. "Can I have breakfast with you? I've never had breakfast in such a tall apartment." Edward hugged Sophia, feeling the overwhelming weight of the responsibility he had taken on. How to explain to a child that his desire to protect her could result in permanent separation? "Of course, sweetheart," he said, forcing a smile. "Let's have breakfast together." While Sophia ate her cereal, Edward and Helena whispered desperate strategies. They knew they needed to go back, face the authorities, and try to explain their motivations, but they also knew that every hour that passed made the situation more complex. Edward's phone rang again. This time it was a number he didn't recognize. "Edward Spencer?" asked a formal male voice. "Yes, who is this?" "Detective Robert Hayes from the Child Protection Unit. Mr. Spencer, we need you to come to the precinct this morning for clarification regarding Sophia Santos's whereabouts." Edward closed his eyes, realizing there was no longer any way to postpone the confrontation. "I'll be there in an hour, Detective. And Mr. Spencer, it would be best if the girl came with you, for her safety, and to resolve this situation as appropriately as possible." When Edward hung up, Helena was looking at him with an expression that mixed fear and determination. "We're coming with you," she said simply. "Ms. Santos, this could complicate things even more." "Edward," she interrupted him, "you risked everything to protect us. Now it's our turn to face this together. as a family. Sophia, sensing the tension in the room, stopped eating and looked between the two adults. "Are we in trouble?" she asked with the devastating honesty that characterized all her observations. Edward knelt down to her height, deciding to be completely honest. "Some people don't understand that we're a family now, and they're worried about you." "Worried how?" "They think maybe you're not safe with us." Sophia frowned, processing the information seriously. Then she took Edward's hand in one and Helena's in the other, creating a small circle of unity. "But I'm safe," she said with absolute conviction. "You make me feel safer than I've ever felt in my whole life. Don't the worried people know that?" Edward felt tears burning his eyes. Sophia's innocent wisdom exposed the absurdity of the whole situation. A child who had finally found safety and love was being protected by people who wanted to separate her from the only people who truly cared about her. "We'll explain it to them, okay?" Edward said. "We'll tell our story the way it really happened." An hour later, they were at the police station. Edward had called his lawyer, but knew he would arrive too late for the initial conversation. Helena held Sophia's hand firmly, and Edward walked beside them, prepared to face any consequences of his choices. Detective Hayes greeted them in a small, formal room. He was a middle-aged man with tired eyes that suggested years of dealing with complex situations involving children. His expression was professional, but Edward detected a genuine curiosity behind the formality. "Mr. Spencer, Ms. Santos." "Sophia," he began, "you're here because we received a complaint that Sophia had gone missing from home during an active social investigation. Can you explain where you've been for the past 48 hours? Edward took a deep breath, preparing to tell the full story. From the first encounter with Sophia at the real estate office to the desperate decision to protect her from the media harassment. He knew his version would sound improbable, perhaps even suspicious. But it was the truth, and at that moment, the truth was all they had. "Detective," Edward began, "I'd like to explain how a question about how much a happy family costs changed all our lives." Sophia squeezed his hand encouragingly, and Edward realized that no matter what happened in that room, he had found something worth any price. A family that was willing to fight for him as much as he was willing to fight for them. Edward recounted the full story to Detective Hayes, from the moment Sophia entered his real estate office, drenched to the decision to protect her from press harassment. His voice remained steady throughout the narrative, even as he described the most vulnerable moments of his personal transformation. The detective listened in silence, taking occasional notes, his expression indecipherable. Helena confirmed every detail, adding her own perspective on how Edward had changed their lives for the better. Sophia, sitting between the two, swung her legs in the too large chair, occasionally nodding when she recognized parts of the story. "It's an interesting story," Detective Hayes said finally, "but I have to deal with facts, not feelings. You removed a child from her residence during an active social investigation without notifying the competent authorities. To protect her from press harassment," Edward retorted. "That's not your decision, Mr. Spencer. There are legal protocols for these situations." At that moment, the door opened and the social worker Clara Jenkins entered, carrying a thick folder. Edward recognized her immediately. It was the woman he had spoken with at the coffee shop weeks before. "Detective Hayes," Clara said, "May I speak with you privately for a moment?" The detective left the room with Clara, leaving Edward, Helena, and Sophia alone for a few tense minutes. Sophia broke the silence with her characteristic honesty. "Uncle Edward, are they going to take me away from you?" Edward looked at Helena, seeing his own terror reflected in her eyes. How to answer that question without lying or terrifying a child? "Sophia," Helena said softly, Sometimes adults need to talk a lot before they understand what children already know. But no matter what happens, you will always be our girl." Sophia nodded, apparently satisfied with the answer, and resumed swinging her legs. Her absolute trust in the face of uncertainty was both inspiring and heartbreaking. 15 minutes later, Detective Hayes returned alone, his expression slightly different, less formal, more thoughtful. "Mr. Spencer, the social worker Clara informed me about your previous conversation and about her independent investigation into Sophia's situation. She also showed me some interesting documents." Edward frowned. "What documents?" "Bank records showing your attempt to anonymously help with the rent, which was returned, dated photographs of your first official visit to their home, and," he paused significantly, "evidence that the photographs that appeared in the press were taken with professional equipment from an angle that suggests prior surveillance." Edward felt his heart race. "Prior surveillance? Mr. Spencer, someone was observing you even before this situation exploded in the media. Someone who knew exactly when and where to find you to capture the most compromising images possible." The realization hit Edward like lightning. Mariana. She hadn't just leaked the photographs. She had orchestrated the entire situation from the beginning. "Detective," Edward said urgently, "I need to make a call. I think I know who's behind this." Before that, the detective interrupted him. "I need you to know that an investor named Ricardo Vasquez was here this morning. He came concerned about your situation and offered resources to help with the legal costs, as long as you agreed to permanently distance yourself from the child." Edward was in complete shock. Ricardo Vasquez was the rival investor who had tried to buy his company several times in recent years, always frustrated by Edward's refusal to sell. Now everything made sense. The smear campaign wasn't just personal, it was professional. "He's trying to emotionally blackmail me," Edward realized aloud. "That was my impression too," the detective agreed, especially when he mentioned it would be a shame if the social investigation resulted in Sophia being placed in temporary state care. Helena gasped. "He was threatening to take Sophia from me to force Edward to sell the company." "I can't prove that yet," the detective said carefully, "but the conversation was enlightening about his true motivations." Sophia, who had been listening to the conversation with growing confusion, finally spoke. "Guys, you're talking about very complicated stuff. Can I ask a simple question?" All the adults looked at her, waiting. "Why do the bad people not want me to have a happy family? I didn't do anything wrong." The silence that followed was devastating. A 6-year-old child had exposed the fundamental cruelty of the entire situation. Adults using her innocent search for love as a weapon in power games she couldn't even comprehend. Detective Hayes knelt down to Sophia's height, his expression softening for the first time. "Sophia, you didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes, when good people find something special, not so good people get jealous and try to spoil it. But my job is to protect you and make sure you stay with the people who truly care about you. So I can stay with my grandma and my Uncle Edward." The detective looked at Edward and Helena, then back at Sophia. "I'm working on it, little one. But first, we need to talk to some people who weren't being honest with us." At that moment, the door opened again and 2 officers entered, escorting a visibly nervous Mariana. Her calculating eyes now showed real panic when she saw Edward, Helena, and Sophia in the room. "Mariana Torres," Detective Hayes said formally, "you are being detained for questioning regarding fabrication of evidence and interference in a social investigation." Edward looked at his former assistant, the woman who had worked by his side for 5 years, who knew all his business secrets, who had explicitly offered to help with Sophia's situation. "Why, Mariana?" he asked, his voice laced with genuine betrayal. Mariana stared at him with a mixture of defiance and desperation. "Because you were going to destroy everything we built together for some sentimental fantasy. The company was our life, Edward. It was our family." "No," Edward said softly, looking at Sophia and Helena. "This is family." And at that moment, surrounded by authorities and facing the consequences of choices he had made for love, Edward Spencer finally understood the difference between having control and having purpose, between success and happiness, between a life built on walls and a life built on bridges. With Mariana detained for questioning, the investigation took a completely new direction. Detective Hayes explained that social worker Clara had discovered irregularities in the anonymous complaints, all made from the same phone, registered in the name of a shell company linked to Ricardo Vasquez. "Mr. Spencer," the detective said, "it appears you and your family have been victims of an orchestrated smear campaign. We are investigating possible charges of slander, defamation, and the use of a minor in a fraudulent scheme." Edward felt a mix of relief and anger. How long will this take to resolve? For the criminal charges, a few weeks. But for Sophia's situation, the detective looked at the girl, who was drawing on a paper Clara had given her. "Clara, can you explain?" The social worker approached with a warm expression. "Edward, Helena, Sophia, after reviewing all the documentation and observing your interaction today, my official recommendation is that Sophia remain under Helena's care, with Edward being formally recognized as a supporting guardian." Helena brought her hand to her chest, her tears finally overflowing. "Does that mean—" "It means you can continue to be a family," Clara smiled. "But we're going to do it the legally correct way this time. Edward, you'll need to go through a formal guardianship evaluation, including background checks and psychological interviews." "I accept any necessary evaluation," Edward said immediately. Sophia looked up from her drawing. "Does this mean I can call you Daddy now, Uncle Edward?" The question hit Edward like lightning. He looked at Helena, who nodded encouragingly through her tears. "If you want to, sweetheart," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "It would be the greatest honor of my life." Sophia leaped from the chair and ran to hug him. "I want to. I've always wanted a daddy who truly chose me." Edward hugged Sophia tightly, realizing he had finally found the answer to the question she had asked weeks ago. A happy family didn't cost money. It cost courage, vulnerability, and the willingness to risk everything for love. 2 hours later, they were free to leave. Outside the precinct, Edward found a group of journalists waiting, but this time he didn't try to avoid them. With Sophia in his right hand and Helena in his left, he approached the microphones. "I have a statement to make," Edward said calmly. 3 weeks ago, a 6-year-old girl walked into my real estate office and asked how much a happy family cost. Today, I discovered that, for some people, the answer is anything is worth destroying one. A journalist shouted a question about his true motivations, but Edward continued without flinching. "My motivation is simple. Sophia taught me that I built a life based on the wrong things. Money, power, professional success, all of it is empty without true love. They tried to use my vulnerability against me, but they discovered that a family united by true love is stronger than any smear campaign." Sophia tugged his sleeve. "Daddy, can I talk too?" Edward knelt down to her height, allowing her to approach the microphone. "My name is Sophia," she said with devastating seriousness, "and I just wanted a family. Now I have a grandma who loves me, a daddy who chose me, and I learned that the people who try to break families are the ones who never had a real one." The journalists were completely silent. A 6-year-old child had exposed the fundamental cruelty of the whole situation with an honesty no adult could have articulated. That afternoon, back in the safe apartment, Edward received a call from his lawyer with surprising news. Ricardo Vasquez had been arrested on multiple charges of blackmail and corporate fraud. Apparently, the scheme against Edward hadn't been his first attempt to manipulate personal situations for financial gain. "And there's more," the lawyer said. "With Vasquez out of the picture and the truth about the smear campaign exposed, several investors who had pulled away are returning. Your company not only survived this, it could emerge stronger." Edward hung up the phone and looked at Sophia, who was helping Helena prepare dinner in the small kitchen. For the first time in his adult life, business success seemed secondary compared to the simple joy of having a family. "Helena," he said, "I have a proposal for you both." "Another one?" she laughed, drying her hands on her apron. "I want you to move into my house, not as guests, but as family. The house is too big for just one person, and—" He paused, searching for the right words. "I don't want to live alone anymore." Sophia shrieked with joy and ran to hug him. Helena approached more slowly, her eyes shining with emotion. "Edward," she said softly, "are you sure? Your life will change completely." "My life already changed completely," he replied. "The moment a brave little girl asked me how much a happy family cost and forced me to realize I didn't know the answer." Helena hugged him, and Edward felt something he hadn't experienced since his parents' death, the sensation of truly being home. That night, as Sophia slept in his arms on the couch, she had insisted on watching a family movie. Edward looked at Helena, who was calmly knitting in a nearby armchair. "Ms. Santos," he whispered, "thank you for letting me be part of your family." Helena looked up from her knitting and smiled. "Edward, you didn't join our family. You helped create a new family, one that none of us could have imagined alone." Edward looked at the sleeping Sophia, her hair spread over his chest, her breathing soft and confident. He thought of the question that had changed everything. How much does a happy family cost? Now he knew the answer. It cost everything you were willing to give, but it was worth infinitely more than any price you could pay. 4 weeks had passed since that rainy morning when Sophia, drenched, walked into Elite Realty Group. Now, on a sunny Saturday morning, Edward woke to the sound of laughter coming from his kitchen, a mansion that had finally become a home. Sophia was sitting on the kitchen counter, swinging her legs as Helena prepared pancakes. The girl wore new unicorn print pajamas, her hair tied in 2 braids that Helena had learned to do by watching YouTube videos. The contrast with the soaked, desperate child who had appeared in his real estate office was striking. "Good morning, Daddy," Sophia shouted when she saw him, jumping off the counter to run towards him. Edward picked her up, spinning her in the air as she laughed with pure joy. "Good morning, sweetheart. Did you sleep well?" "I dreamed we were a real family," she said, then frowned. "But then I remembered it's not a dream anymore. It's real life." Helena approached, offering Edward a cup of coffee. She woke up at 6 this morning, excited for today. Edward smiled, remembering what made that day special. It was the day of Sophia's first school presentation about My Class Family, a project where each child would present their family to the class. After breakfast, they got ready carefully. Sophia chose her favorite dress, navy blue with small flowers, which Edward had bought specifically for special occasions. Helena wore an elegant but simple outfit that made her look years younger. Edward opted for a casual suit, no tie, a symbolic shift from his old professional rigidity. In the car, on the way to school, Sophia held a drawing she had made as part of her presentation. It was a large house with 3 figures in front, a grey-haired lady, a tall man in a suit, and a small girl holding both their hands. Above the house, in carefully drawn letters, was written, "My chosen family." "Sophia," Edward said, looking in the rear-view mirror, "are you nervous about the presentation?" "A little bit," she admitted. "But the teacher said that all families are different and special in their own way. Ours is special because you chose me, and I chose you too." Edward exchanged an emotional glance with Helena. Sophia's wisdom continued to surprise him every day. When they arrived at school, they were greeted by Sophia's teacher, Mrs. Carmen, a warm 50-year-old woman who had closely followed the girl's transformation in recent weeks. "Edward, Helena," she said, "you can't imagine the difference in Sophia since you became a family. She's more confident, more participatory, more happy." The classroom was decorated with all the children's drawings of their families. Edward observed the varied representations: traditional families, single-parent families, grandparent caregivers, adoptive families. Each drawing told a unique story of love in its own way. When it was Sophia's turn, she confidently stood up and walked to the front of the room, holding her drawing. "My name is Sophia Santos Spencer," she began, and Edward felt his heart race as he heard her surname included. "This is my special family." She showed the drawing to the class. "This is my grandma Helena, who always took care of me and taught me that love doesn't need a lot of money. This is my daddy Edward, whom I didn't have to buy because he really chose me. And this is me, who now has a complete family." A girl from the class raised her hand. "Sophia, was your dad always your dad?" "No," Sophia answered honestly. "He became my dad when he found out that families are made with the heart, not with money. Before that, he was just a very rich but very sad man. Now he's a daddy rich with love." Edward felt tears burning his eyes. Sophia's description was more accurate than any psychological analysis could be. "And your grandma?" another child asked. "My grandma was always my family, even when it was just the two of us, but now she has someone to help take care of me, and I have two people who love me very much." The teacher smiled. "Sophia, what have you learned about families?" Sophia thought for a moment. With the seriousness that characterized her deepest reflections, "I learned that family isn't who you're born with. It's who chooses to stay with you, even when things get tough. It's who loves you when you're sad, who celebrates when you're happy, and who never gives up on you, even when other people don't understand." She paused, looking directly at Edward and Helena. "And I learned that sometimes, when you're looking for something very important, you find people who were looking for the same thing you were. My daddy Edward needed a family as much as I did. He just didn't know it yet." The room was silent for a moment. Even the other children seemed to grasp the depth of what Sophia had shared. "And what was the most special part of finding your family?" the teacher asked. Sophia smiled, her face lighting up completely. "The most special part was finding out that a happy family has no price. Because it's made of things you can't buy: hugs, laughter, care, and people who stay with you even when it's raining." When the presentation ended, the class applauded enthusiastically. Edward stood up, approaching Sophia with Helena by his side. "Daddy!" Sophia whispered, hugging him tightly. "Now everyone knows we have a real family." "Yes, sweetheart," Edward replied, his voice choked with emotion. "And now I know the answer to your question that first day." "What answer? How much does a happy family cost?" Edward smiled, looking at Helena and then at Sophia. "It doesn't cost money. It costs the courage to open your heart, the patience to build true love, and the strength to protect that love when other people don't understand." Sophia nodded, satisfied. "Then we paid the right price." "We certainly did," Helena said, joining the hug. As they left the school, Edward reflected on the 4 weeks that had completely transformed his life. He had lost Mariana and some contracts, but gained something infinitely more valuable. His company not only survived the scandal, it prospered, now run by someone who understood that true success included genuine human connections. That afternoon, back in the house they now truly called home, Edward watched Sophia playing in the garden that Helena had begun to plant, transforming the formal space into something vibrant and welcoming. The girl who had once tried to buy a family now lived in one that had been built through love, courage, and the willingness of 3 imperfect people to become a perfect family for themselves. Edward picked up his phone and looked at the first photo they had taken together as a family, all 3 smiling on the porch of the Blue House, before all the storm that had tested and strengthened them. He now understood that Sophia hadn't walked into his real estate office looking to buy a family. She had walked in to teach him that true families aren't bought. They are chosen, built, and protected with the kind of love that has no price because it's not for sale. And so, The man who spent his life selling houses to other families finally learned to build a home for his own.